Welcome to the show that focuses on Mother Africa. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. This week we speak to Bob Collymore, the CEO of Safaricom Limited. We get his views on corporate responsibility, leadership and development in Africa. Let's get his insights into business in Africa, leadership and development. Thank you so much, Bob, for making time for the Africa Leadership Dialogues. If you had a message for corporate leaders across Africa, what would that be?
Think about your business not in the short term. Not just corporate Africa, the corporate world tends to think of their business according to the quarterly reporting cycle or the half-yearly reporting cycle or the annual reporting cycle. You have to think about your business the way Unilever thinks about its business. And I often single out Unilever because it's a company that's been around for 120 years or so. It's a long time. And when you talk to the leadership in that company, Paul Pullman will tell you that he wants to leave a legacy which is a company successfully managing 120 years from now. So business leaders, I would really urge them to really think about the long term. And if you're going to think about the long term, you have to think about the challenges facing the continent. You have to think about 30% youth. 30% of our youth are illiterate. And that's the problem. If you look at manufacturing only represents 9% of the continent's GDP, right? So, but agriculture, on the other hand, which represents 20%, uses 80% of the workforce. And it's not good quality work. If you compare that to jobs that are being created in Europe or in the US, it's not agriculture where you're trying to farm half an acre.
We talked about the challenge and you said, we could fail if we don't focus. If we fail, that means for Africa, continued poverty, desperation, loss of hope. We're seeing an increase in radicalization. What would your message to African leaders at this point then be?
So the first thing is I would define African leaders because we often think about African leaders as being the political class. And the political class is a very short-term class. Typically, it's less than 5 years. The first year, you're settling into the job. Business leaders, on the other hand, have set an institution which has a long way to go. So when we talk about leaders, we have to talk about public and private sector leaders. Then the second thing I'd say is that think about responsibility. Think about dealing with the issues that the continent faces. We talked about youth. The so-called youth bulge or youth challenges which are coming. Think about 92 out of every 1,000 children failing to reach their 5th birthday. Think about, the continent is home to about 2% of the world doctors, but 14% of the world's population.
Shocking.
We have to have a healthy, an educated, and an economically empowered continent if we're to avoid that. I don't want to be a prophet of doom because actually I'm an African optimist.
Okay.
I really believe that the continent will ride it, but I do believe that we need to step up as leaders, business and private and public sector leaders.
The Safaricom Foundation has been getting involved in the whole Sustainable Development Goals conversation, along with all the other work that it does. But why? Why are you engaging in the idea of the SDGs and achievement of the SDGs? Is it just pulling on from the social responsibility aspect? What are you hoping to achieve as part of that program?
Well, a kind of small refinement to that. It's not really Safaricom Foundation that's doing it. It's Safaricom that's doing it. Because often if you put things in foundations, as I said, you often end up compartmentalizing it.
Right.
And we have to embed those things. Now, of course, the SDGs, there are far too many of them. I mean, I'm a big critic of having 17 goals. Even I can't remember them. And some of them are a little bit motherhood and apple pie, let's end poverty. But of course, we have a huge interest in ending poverty across the continent, and more specifically in Kenya. Because if you can end poverty, then we will have a more thriving business. If we can deal with that issue, we'll have a much stronger society in which to operate. Even in my own company, if we can deal with gender diversity, and we're 50-50, but it's not uniform across the organization, we will make much better decisions than we would if we were all female or all male. So it is essential for the corporate world, not just the corporate Kenyan world, the corporate world to embrace these sustainable development goals, because it will just create a more equitable society for us to operate 120 years from now.
A lot of people watching will be stunned at your story, growing up in Guyana and sharing toilets, and a lot of people here in Africa, as you said, connect to that. What would you say propelled you to success? Are there characteristics or traits that you would encourage young people to embrace?
I think it's about finding a purpose. I heard a lovely phrase the other day that says the two most important days of your life. The first is when you were born, and the second is when you discover why you were born. And I think as a company, we kind of discovered that a good while back, and I'm just lucky to have inherited it from Michael Joseph, my predecessor. But I think we do understand why we're there, and we believe that we're there to transform lives. And not to relieve poverty or suffering, but to transform it. And if we can use ICT and the tools that we have to hand to make a difference and to make a life different, we believe that's what we're kind of there for.
You've said you're an Afro-optimist. If indeed we start to get things right, we're starting to see more democratic processes. We do still have some conflicts and insecurity in parts of Africa, but we have economies growing faster than many of the other economies of the world. Where could we be in the next 10 years? What do you see?
So let me just challenge, and this is probably going to be a little bit controversial, but let me just challenge this thing about let's see more democratic
spaces.
More democratic spaces. I'm not sure that that's always necessary. Now, as I said, it's a little controversial. And I'm not sure that we should pursue this concept of democracy at all costs, and that it is always relevant to different societies. We are a continent of 54, depends how you count the countries, but 54 different countries, 54 different cultures, actually a lot more subcultures, and they don't always work. Democracy doesn't always work in those societies, and we shouldn't just blindly pursue it. So, I mean, that's my piece of controversy. I think that we can see some states where you might challenge the democratic principles, or whether the democratic principles really are being applied. However, if you say, are those countries successful? Are they achieving some of those important things? Are they reducing maternal mortality rates? Are they improving the health of the nation, the education of the nation? The answer could be yes. And if you look at some states, if you look at places like Singapore, you might question whether Singapore really did embrace democracy in the way that some countries would have them do it. And often I think, sorry to cut you off there, but often I think that some of the bigger states leverage the help and assistance that they offer in order to impose their own political ideology, and I'm not sure it always.
We'd love you to deliver a personal message to Africans at whatever level. How can we all be part of uplifting the African continent? Please look into the camera.
I was having breakfast with a European this morning, and we talked about Africa, the continent. And I said to her, can you draw the continent of Europe? Draw a map of the continent of Europe. And of course, she couldn't do it. You ask anybody to draw the map of Africa, and they can do it. And if you look at that within the context of unification, if we can start to really think the way we think about that map, let's start to think as Africans, because otherwise it's impossible for us to compete with India, with China. The Human Development Index, we had the same Human Development Index as India and China in 1970. Today, China is 30 percentage points ahead of the continent. So let's start to think like Africans, not like Zambians or Kenyans or South Africans, not like Kikuyus or Luos or whichever tribe you might belong to. Think as a continent, act as a continent, and take responsibility for your continent because it's yours, it's no one else's.
It's amazing. Thank you so much, Bob.
You're welcome.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.